Hello everyone, and welcome to this next episode in this series of conversations with our RICS tech partners. My name's Andrew Knight. I've been with RICS for over 10 years now, and I work in the directorate within RICS that looks at standards, regulation, and thought leadership. And my role is to look at globally the effect of data and technology right across the built and natural environment and how that impacts our profession, working as they do right across the property life cycle, in residential, commercial, infrastructure, and land itself. So really happy today to introduce Ivo and Stephen from the Proptech Connection. So do join me, Ivo and Stephen.
Hey, Andrew, how are you?
Very well.
Hello,
Well, welcome both of you today. And as ever, I always like to start these episodes with a bit of a deep dive on you as individuals, your backstory, and indeed who Proptech Connection are and why you started it. So I don't know who wants to go first, but please do give us a bit of a flavour of your skills and experience and what led you to create the Proptech Connection.
Yeah, so maybe I'll kick it off. Obviously, thanks first and foremost having us here today on this call. Just to give you a little bit of flavor of who I am personally. So my name is Ivo, born and raised in the Netherlands, so that's why I have the funny accent. So studied there international business and finance, and then basically moved into different continents. So initially moved to Asia, divided my time between Vietnam and Singapore, lived there a couple of years, then moved to South America, lived in Argentina, Buenos Aires, and then 7 years ago decided to go to the US. So I've been residing ever since here in Chicago, which I call home these days. Initially got involved in the construction side of the industry, meaning that I was working primarily with owners and developers on large scale projects all across the US. And then around 2017, you had that first PropTech hype or bubble, depending who you ask, and decided that I wanted to be more in the forefront of that. So repurposed a lot of my efforts. And what that meant on my day-to-day life is that I did some consulting work for a Wall Street investment bank that was exploring the PropTech waters. So I was helping them validate if certain deals were worth pursuing. They did not have any exposure or network in that ecosystem. So they were leveraging my skill set in that sense. Then obviously I joined and started with the Proptech Connection. Probably worth noting that I have a pretty broad network in that ecosystem around technology, investments, and real estate. Over 20,000 folks on LinkedIn alone. A majority of those are situated here in the US, but a large chunk obviously in Europe, LATAM, and APAC. So very short, that's me. Stephen, maybe you want to give a flavor on yourself as well.
Sure. Thank you, Ivo. Hopefully people can tell I'm from Scotland, but I'm actually currently based here in Sydney, Australia. In terms of my background, trained as an accountant, chartered accountant with PricewaterhouseCoopers in Edinburgh. Then following that, I joined a clean tech venture capital fund, one of the few at the time. This is about 10 years ago. Investing in solar, wave, building materials. So really got a flavour for understanding how to invest, but also understanding the impact of built environment infrastructure and the types of technology which are now very much in vogue. I guess at the time it probably wasn't, as it was a much more difficult process compared to now. I then moved across here to Australia about 10 years ago, joined one of the major REITs down here, worked initially very closely with the Cap Trans team, buying and selling assets. I was doing a lot of the financials and from a group perspective in terms of that, so I got a very good understanding of multiple sectors. It's also an integrated developer, so I really cut my teeth in understanding the drivers of from a commercial aspect in terms of what people were looking for in terms of some of the key metrics. I then moved across to the residential division, so it's pretty substantial, 3,500 units per year, $2 billion of capital, 60 live projects. So my job there was effectively to look at ways we can improve the ROI on the capital base. So I looked at a number of projects, I looked at different state allocations, but then really got into the detail around what drives these projects, what drives the IRR, and then laterally I was then asked to kind of run a bit of the data analytics team there and look to bring in some technologies, i.e. PropTechs, in terms of helping us understand that data to drive insights from there. And then joined Australia's largest PropTech VC fund as their investment director, which I did for a couple of years before setting up the Proptech Connection about 2 years ago. So just high level before maybe we touch on the Proptech Connection, just in terms of personal experience, in terms of seeing deals, I think I've seen about 2,500 deals in the PropTech space. I think I've interviewed something like 800 founders. and between Evo and I, and we'll come on to it, we have a pretty good reach globally. We have 35, 40 venture scouts across the world. We have over 13,000 Proptechs on our database. And as a result of that, we've got a pretty unique position in the market, coming from that commercial viewpoints, from an investment point of view, but also understanding real estate and having worked with a number of Proptechs as well. So where we sit is in between all three of those players, and we apply that knowledge that we both have to be able to facilitate adoption within the industry.
So what was the catalyst to get you and your colleague together to start the Proptech Connection?
We came together because there was a number of problems within the industry, and there is, as Buzz, as Evo mentioned, around 2017, that first wave of Proptech, and there was a lot of people I saw seeking funding that actually I felt really didn't understand real estate. And then the other side of that, you had real estate people who were facing just the general public facing these new concepts around tech, and they felt like there was a bit of a gap in terms of that translation piece. So it needed somebody with a skill set to be able to translate that. And I think secondly, this is why Evo and I came together, is because he's an extensive network as well globally, is that there's actually a lot of international funds that are looking to deploy capital with global mandates. But what's happening is you have these rather large funds with small origination teams that aren't actually seeing best-in-class deals. So you're then seeing this kind of constriction of capital in terms of investment, and these Proptechs actually not getting funded because they don't actually have access or knowledge of these other funds internationally. So that was effectively why we started.
So I mean, given your knowledge and your network and your depth of experience, what would be your sort of almost 101 to lay people about what are the issues in terms of making these connections? What are your high level insights? What do you think the macro problems are? And also in terms of the jargon, we obviously look at it from our perspective at RICS right across the life cycle, across all these asset types. So we're kind of arguably looking at these terms: Proptech, Contech, Infratech, the gray area where it bleeds into FinTech and PlanTech, and everything seems to have the word tech at the end of it. What's your kind of summary between the two of you of the landscape, the issues, the problems, the trends?
Yeah, maybe just to unpack, and one of the drivers that Stephen has already mentioned for us, obviously starting the Proptech Connection, is that we feel that the Proptech landscape is extremely inefficient and fragmented. So we try to, democratize some of that information, I would say. And then second, to Stephen's point as well, is obviously technology is not limited by any geographical limitations. So we felt that oftentimes not best-in-class technologies would win or get obviously investment or clients. So that's on a macro level a problem that we try to solve. In terms of what we see, our day-to-day consists out of speaking to all the different stakeholders. So we are in a lot of calls, meaning that we speak obviously to some of the largest investors globally, as well as buyers, as well as obviously some of these Proptechs. And by virtue of that, we have a lot of knowledge in terms of obviously what's happening. So we see some key macro trends that we see specifically, for example, from an investor standpoint, is that ESG is very high on the agenda, I would say, all across all the different stakeholders in real estate, because obviously, you have that entire value chain. So a lot of folks are involved in projects across the life cycle of that asset. I would say with regards to ESG, there's a lot of talking, but not actually a lot of capital deployment. So it's a lot of greenwashing. I'm not sure if that's the right term, but I think a lot of people are talking about it, but in terms of actual capital deployment, I think it's insignificant. However, we feel that the wall of money is coming. So I think that's one. The second trend that we actually see that is very, very hot to say is Contech, right? So you already made that determination. Yeah. Is it Proptech and Contech, or is it all under the same umbrella? I guess that's a question depending who you ask. But it's part of our umbrella, I would say. So that's probably the second hottest item on the investor side. Maybe Stephen, you want to speak a little bit what we see on the tech buyer side.
Yeah, I think so. I still think there's the technology is moving so fast, and there's obviously the mindset. I think a lot of times the Proptechs really position their technology to raise funding, and that makes complete sense. But I think what that means is it can sometimes be quite confusing for the tech buyer that's working off least incentive cap rates, whales, IRRs or whatever, and to make that translation's quite difficult. And that's one of the reasons why I think Contech's actually been quite successful, because the value proposition of the technology is quite clear. If you start to say to someone you've got a space utilization technology which puts you into a 5-year contract and has a no retrofit capability, that value proposition becomes really, really difficult to articulate. So I think, and then things like ESG are actually quite interesting because it's a concept that's bandied about quite a lot. And I think there's still an education piece in actually understanding what it is about the Sustainable Development Goals and then COP26 at the end of the year. So there's, I think in fairness to everyone, the market is moving very quick, but there is buzzwords, and you're starting to see companies like ours fill that position because we're able to do that translation piece, and that makes it a lot easier for people. And I think from an adoption point of view, I think as the technology kind of subsides in terms of its velocity of change, you'll start to see that adoption piece come on a bit more as well.
I mean, it's interesting. You were mentioning some very fundamental, commercial real estate investment metrics there. I mean, has there been a continuing feature where some of the tech firms haven't still been understanding some of those drivers that real estate investors look at, and there's that been slight disconnect where people who've been technically very strong bringing solutions to the market, but not realizing that they have to show that causal correlation between what their product does and, high quality tenants, higher market rents, higher rates of return on an asset, that they need to show, particularly in that commercial real estate area, that direct correlation between what their product does from a technical perspective and those outcomes that for better or for worse people place value on when they're looking at investment. Do you think that's still a problem, that kind of lack of knowledge of actually real estate as the slightly idiosyncratic, old-fashioned asset that it perhaps is in some respects?
There is a difficulty in understanding, and as you said, it is a very nuanced industry, real estate. It's quite unique in that everyone has an opinion, but actually the metrics behind it are quite curated. I think part of the challenge as well is it's not a homogeneous product. So someone might, and people use sector classifications as the kind of denomination, but just because I own a shopping center and my competitor owns a shopping center, it doesn't mean the use case for the technology will be the same. And I think that's where, because it's such it's a kind of concentrated but fragmented market, it makes it quite difficult. And the example when we're explaining to people about this is if you do lead to settlement and off the plan residential, there's something like 220 manual touch points or 150 depending on who you speak to. So if you're a value proposition coming in there from a data point of view, how do you position yourself where you can then scale that across 100 project marketers, for example? And I think that's part of the challenge, is that you actually need a really good skill set to be able to sell it to different players in the market at scale.
I suppose once again that echoes back that thing about having that domain knowledge, expertise of real estate as well as your technical product. That, as you say, the use cases are subtly different, and you can't be going out selling a vanilla kind of formulaic approach in that way.
Yes, and sorry, and maybe to zoom out even more and go in more to a macro level, what we also tend to see basically all across the globe is that you see, obviously from a regulatory standpoint, you see obviously in Europe you have the new Green Deal, right? And in Asia, certain countries also have very ambitious plans. So we've been speaking to very senior executives in some of the largest real estate companies across the globe, and a lot of folks say, hey, we have these certain thresholds that we need to hit, but have honestly no idea how they're going to do it, because these deadlines are coming up, 2030, 2040, and it's very ambitious. So I think there's a big job that needs to be done in order to get there. So, but that again, it's one level higher, right? So just wanted to mention that as well.
So given by the sounds of it, your job very much sounds like, for both of you, solving problems. How do you go about that? What's your approach? How do you actually take those stakeholders, because as you say, there are multiple stakeholders involved here. How do you take them on this journey and help them get to that better destination?
I think the first thing that we did is we basically we've mapped out the core aspects of each vertical that we've mentioned. So we've mapped out what we think everything is from the technology point of view. We've mapped out everything from the investment point of view. I say everything in a very loose term, everything from a real estate point of view. So
Yeah.
what we've then done is we've then gone out, and Ivo can maybe talk to in a second about the venture scout network he runs, but we then have a series of scouts across the world that feed us in deals, so technologies. And we've then mapped out, so we've taken a company from startup through to the commercial use case within real estate. And then from there, we've then got this kind of database, or we do have this database and this technology behind it that allows us then to source the right technology for a real estate company or developer or whoever it may be. And then on the other side of that, we then work with large real estate companies and try and unpack actually what the commercial use cases is. So if it's, as we mentioned earlier, the metrics whale, is it nav, is it whatever it may be, we can then actually say, well, you thought you needed this for as a technology, but this is a suite of technologies globally that's being used to derive that commercial outcome. So they want something for their commercial use case, and that's how we go about that process.
Ivo, what's your take on how you solve these problems then?
So I think where I think we're different, and I really feel we have a very compelling story when we speak to different stakeholders in the market. And I think where we're different, Andrew, is one, we operate globally. So I lead our global origination and partnerships and network efforts. And as Stephen mentioned, we have now 41 venture scouts across the globe that give us access to local markets. And again, that gives us that widespread. So I think from a tech buyer perspective, we work for one of the largest real estate companies here in the US, and they were looking into solving or actually incorporating an IoT platform for their business. So they came to us, just to give you a flavor in terms of what they needed, a project brief, and then we scan our network, our database, and obviously the venture scouts, and try to see which PropTech would fulfill those requirements. So we have a very data-driven process, the way we assess those PropTechs and the way we look at it, as Stephen has mentioned, and then we present them to the tech buyer in a very consistent format. So I always try to explain that if there's a sales or investment transaction, I think with our network expertise, instead of that first meeting being meeting 0, that transaction being meeting 10, I think with our process, I think we can get both parties at the meeting at meeting 6, 7, or 8, if that makes sense. So again, facilitating and expediting that process. And I think the second thing where we're different is that our team has sat down on every seat on the table. So we worked as an investor, we worked as a tech buyer, and obviously extensively with PropTechs. We've seen a lot of deals, a lot of pitches, etc. So I think we're able to distill and articulate the most relevant information for the different stakeholders, right? And I think that translation piece is, I think, something where we are very strong and where I think a lot of clients really value what we bring to the table.
Yeah, I understand. I suppose one thing that interests me particularly is I suppose just in the way that fintech has evolved. Obviously, the tech providers have matured in their understanding of the sector and the understanding of how to develop the right solutions. What are your thoughts on the way, the tech buyers, the traditional, if I can use that phrase, the traditional real estate firms that we all know so well? How have you seen their journey in terms of maturity along this cycle about understanding how to use technology, and indeed whether they're developing it internally or obviously sourcing it? How are you seeing their journey evolving? Because obviously one could argue, depending on your viewpoint, that real estate and property has been quite a sort of an untechnical sector, and it's still very fragmented, and there's still an awful lot of work to do around data standardization, et cetera, et cetera. So how have you seen that journey from their perspective?
Yeah, I think there's a large appetite. Most major players that we've spoken to have increased funding from an operational point of view to use technology. I think where we're seeing an evolution is the way they source that. So I think people have tried CVCs. I think the accelerator programs were tried to make success. Some are very good, some potentially didn't give the ROI.
And to Stephen's point, so maybe it was interesting. So last week I was in Vegas at a large PropTech event here in the US, and you see, actually it was the first one in 2 years, to be honest, getting out again. So it was pretty exciting. But what you see there's a lot of ambition, there's a lot of energy in this space, a lot of capital. So you see the big Wall Street investment banks are coming in, are looking around. So I think in terms of opportunity, obviously the regulatory side, the macro trends that we tend to see, I think this is I would say maybe the new fintech environment. Obviously, it's a very mature market already, and I think Proptech is, I mean, let's not forget it's the biggest asset class across the globe, right? So, and it has been very much lagging behind in terms of technology adoption. Same obviously on the construction side of things. So I think we're on the early stages of a very exciting time.
I mean, with all that money, you know, looking for yield and looking to invest in the sector, what do you think are the dangers in terms of misallocation of capital if it's not channeled correctly? Because clearly there will be some risks if there's so much dry powder out there looking for opportunities.
I think you're actually seeing an equalization. I think that's definitely a risk that happened in the US, and anecdotally, we're hearing this movement away from the US. We're seeing a greater appetite for European and APAC deals, just from a value proposition point of view. So I think there's definitely an equalization. Where there is pressure is PE funds are actually coming up the risk curve up the risk curve in terms of their appetite from growth capital, whereas they probably see pre-IPO, they're now coming further down to see deals. And I think that's a function of, if you're Series B and in PropTech, you've probably got pretty good traction, you'll have some pretty good customers, and your risk profile will be a lot less than maybe a fintech or some other kind of technology sector.
Yeah, and I think also to Stephen's point, I think in terms of there's obviously risk. I mean, it's a VC world, but we believe that there is also going to be a lot of consolidation in certain verticals. It's a very busy space, so probably you're going to get a few winners, to say so. On the private equity, folks are also looking. So yeah, I just wanted to add that as well.
Yeah, I mean, consolidation was on my my list of questions because it doesn't seem tenable that there's going to be the, you know, I mean, it's in any Darwinian process like this, there's clearly going to be consolidation. I mean, do you at a macro level, do you only see any areas where that's already beginning to happen within the various niches of Contech, Proptech, etc.?
I think building management systems and building management system software is definitely something. I mean, that's highly sticky, highly fragmented. I think, well, you saw JLL buy Skyline AI a couple of weeks ago. I think data platforms that are in different geographies but using similar methodologies, you've got a couple of major incumbents there that potentially are quite keen to kind of acquire as well. So when you've got that kind of product that is scalable globally, and you have, as I said, like quite good traction in different markets, then that's a natural space we think will be filled.
And what do you think the trajectory is for, once again, I use that phrase, the traditional firms to increasingly innovate in-house? I mean, you know, I suppose arguably a lot of the fintech firms are still succeeding because arguably some of the majors in the capital markets aren't necessarily themselves doing all this innovation. But do you see the established industry becoming much more technical themselves and less reliant on, you know, a PropTech world to support their growth and innovation?
Yeah. I'm sorry, I thought you were going to say something. Yeah, very, very much so. Like, I think there's an evolution. We've spoken to a lot of recruiters, for example, recently, and part of the feedback there is that it's actually quite difficult to write a job description if you're an employer, because what is that role and what does it look like? And I mean, it is moving very fast, and it's a very risk-averse asset, and I think, or asset class. And I think being able to innovate at speed, and it's actually been very difficult. To kind of slightly contrary to the point I made earlier about the VC funds, there's still a big role for a lot of them investing in the funds to kind of get their access there, if it's the right fit for them, because there's mutual benefit there from a strategic point of view, and I think that'll give a lot of insight as well. But I think that's definitely the two trends that I'm seeing.
So, I mean, on that point, are you seeing a real step change in the kind of skill sets that the traditional firms now want with their people? Because obviously both of you got very, very rich mix of skill sets, but I'm guessing the traditional firms are having to think, well, what's the kind of profile of people we bring into the business now, either as grads or the kind of people they want to bring in who've already gone down the career path in a certain sector, perhaps in analytics or economics or whatever it may be. Are you seeing some structural shifts there in terms of skill sets within property companies?
So I think just on a macro level, what we tend to see, obviously, the average age of, let's say, the Proptechs versus the average age as the decision makers on the real estate side is obviously quite substantial. So I think you're gonna get a little shift, because you see, not necessarily in real estate, I'm not claiming that every company is going to become a technology company or whatnot. But what I believe is going to happen is that much more of the millennials and Gen Z, as they're being called, right, are getting more significant roles in real estate companies, because obviously there is a transformation into technology that is being driven by those young folks first, and secondly, you also see, obviously, on the tenant side or on the customer side, that a lot of those ESG and a lot of those objectives, tenant experience, etc., are being driven by these tenants, which are, again, the younger generation that obviously is starting to make more money, etc. And so that's one thing that I see.
Just almost a technical question, because with an industry that's been so fragmented over the years and not being particularly technically advanced, what are you seeing in terms of the trends around the availability of data and sharing data and data as seen as itself an asset in terms of being able to run commercial real estate, whatever it be? You know, what are you seeing in terms of those trends? Are people waking up even more to the value of the data, but conversely, are they beginning to become more willing to share it across the sector and gain the analytical benefit of having more open, structured data?
Yeah, I think the concept of big data has been bouncing around for a while. And even I believe quite strongly that that's still a resource that's not fully been tapped. And I think there's been an explosion in the data available, but there's still space to actually use that to drive insights. I think, and people are now starting to marry that up with their experience. As I said, it's quite an esoteric space, real estate, and it's quite nuanced in terms of people's knowledge. So I don't think data will ever replace, or the speed of replacement might not be as quick as in other areas, but you definitely are starting to people see those collaborative tools, especially in something like Contech, where you're actually now starting to get insights into project execution, you're starting to get insights into delivery, and if you roll it up at a portfolio level, if you're a developer or a general contractor, the value of those insights are becoming much more real in terms of dollars, so then you're actually seeing that adoption coming much more strongly.
Igo, what are your thoughts on that whole sort of data argument in terms of availability and sharing? And
yeah, so as Stephen mentioned, we see an explosion of data suppliers, to say so. But I think obviously that everybody's talking about data, but it's about obviously the richness and the availability of data, but it's much more obviously what do you do with those data points and how do you use them obviously to your commercial benefit. Again, here we see quite a lot of Proptechs that are obviously trying to get into the space. As Stephen mentioned, I think we're going to see also there a lot of consolidation.
And you both mentioned earlier that the activity and certainly the rhetoric around that whole ESG piece, and I guess almost linked to the data issue, is I've been talking to a number of investors and they're I think very frustrated by the fact they can't get the ESG data to drive the kind of decisions they want to make around potentially stranded assets or any kind of green premiums or brown haircuts on assets. I mean, what if you had your crystal ball out, where do you see that kind of ESG data availability, ability to really genuinely deliver on ESG going, given your knowledge and your network of what's going on around the world?
I think the biggest challenge is actually the retrofit capability of ESG technologies, and where I think coupled with the movement to premium buildings and amenity-driven buildings as a result of COVID, or a result of a number of reasons, but COVID being a major catalyst, I think you're going to see a real challenge in the space in B-grade and C-grade buildings, which might actually change the use of those buildings, because I think the costs, it's not the technology's fault, but I just think the fundamental cost to be able to change those buildings is going to be so great. And we're seeing anecdotally that play out, where major funds are actually exiting from some of those spaces because the cost to actually meet these new ESG requirements is actually too great.
Would you agree, Ivo?
Yeah, totally. I think Stephen pretty much summarized it there as to what we hear and see in the marketplace. Yeah, for sure.
I mean, that's certainly our house view, our concern that you know the number of new, if I can use the phrase, sort of shiny assets is so small compared to that huge long tail of secondary and tertiary assets that it is a huge risk. And I guess investors are waking up to that, and as you say, exiting with voting with their feet in terms of understanding that those assets will not be giving them the kind of return or indeed the expense to bring them up to that level is going to be prohibitive. So I think we're going to see, I guess, a lot of flux and fluidity over valuation in that sector because there's going to be some real unknowns. I guess it's a similar thing, that flight to quality within retail, where there's been a similar polarization in many markets, hasn't there?
I think the other thing that's worth noting is a couple of points. I think if you look at APAC, for example, so APAC has the same number of air conditioners in the world as the rest of the world. And then that's before you factor in India and Indonesia. And if you look at somewhere like Hong Kong, 33% of its energy cost is actually used on air conditioning. Now, as a behavioral change, getting that to change to the level, which is the global average is 11%. So getting that to change in that ecosystem is really, really difficult on a retrofit basis. But the second thing is, it doesn't matter what technology you have, India and Indonesia are massive growing economies. So how do you mandate something that can then be affordable in these different wealth regions as well? And I think that's part of the challenge with the universal ESG rules. Like I appreciate encouraging, but I think if I was a portfolio owner or a developer or wherever it may be, I wouldn't be not disenchanted, but I would this comfort in the fact that everyone has the challenge, I guess, is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, no, I understand. Well, we've covered a lot of ground today. It's been fascinating. I guess my final question, once again, asking you to get your sort of predictive crystal balls out, but where do you see Proptech Contek going over the short term? What did you hear in Las Vegas? What are your short-term predictions?
So my short-term predictions are that a lot of new folks are going to get into the space. So I think in Vegas, what you see there is that a lot of the more traditional technology verticals are looking into PropTech, not only from a startup point of view, but also from an investor standpoint. So you see a lot of traction there. I think we're in the very early cycle of a bull run, to speak in trader jargon. But I think it's really an exciting space, and I think it's also a global opportunity, right? Because we saw and still see that it's obviously all these silos, but now you see also obviously that being opened. Another thing that I see is that some of the largest asset owners in the world, so some of these sovereign wealth funds, are also looking into getting more involved into the space. So I think on one side, having that regulatory and on all these very ambitious goals, accelerating obviously this ecosystem, combined with a lack of digitization in both construction and real estate, funneled with all the investment and these startups, I think is a recipe for a lot of excitement in the mid and the short term, but also the long term.
Thanks, Stephen. Your thoughts?
Yeah, I think, ESG Contech we've touched on. There was still 5,000 deaths in the USA last year on construction sites. So there's still a lot of not easy wins, but there's still things that shouldn't be happening that can be fixed or should be fixed. And I think on the tech buyer side, there's probably a greater understanding the market all around, which I think will facilitate adoption. I think PropTechs, they're definitely much more mature. You're starting to see older, experienced industry veterans. So not, say, 35, 45 coming up and setting up their own technology company, whereas before it was maybe more younger people with no industry experience moving into the sector. And I think that'll definitely help. They'll have the relationships with B, they'll fully understand the business, and I think that'll actually drive a lot of adoption, and then success breeds success from there, I think.
And
so overall, sorry, Ivor, carry on.
Yeah, and one more thing, maybe I think I think a lot of people are also not ready for what's coming, simply because it's very difficult to foresee. But if you understand what's happening and all, if we talk about 5G, IoT, blockchain, autonomous vehicles, right? All these technologies, artificial intelligence, machine learning, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. All these technologies obviously growing exponentially, all coming together. That's going to be a recipe for a lot of disruption. So I think, I mean, I'm very excited about the future, but I just wanted to bring that point also, because we see all these things coming together, and the speed and the companies that we're looking at is just incredible in a short period of time.
I think you're right. I suppose the optimistic, I mean, that's an optimistic vision itself, but I guess coupled with that is a sense of maturity I'm getting from you in terms of the fact that actually both sides, you know, excluding perhaps, well, if you include the investors as well, but all the parties are, by the sounds of it, reaching a level of maturity and understanding, which means it's going to be easier to handle that wave of innovation, get the value from it, and not misallocate capital. So it feels like a very optimistic place we're in, with a degree of maturity now.
I would say that the real estate companies have misallocated capital. I think there's been a lot of successful relationships done. I think it's more around speed and best fit, where I think you'll see adoption of global solutions now, where previously it might just have been regional or through another mechanism. I think you'll start to see that.
I suppose I was thinking more of a risk of future misallocation if there was too much investment, you know, and not identifying the right opportunities to place that capital in. But no, your point was well made. Ivo, sorry, a final comment from you.
No, sorry. I think Stephen nailed it.
Great. Well, it's been wonderful talking to you both, and there's plenty more I'd like to pick up on our next episode. So I look forward to talking with you both again. But thanks again for your time today.
Thank you so much, Andrew, for having us.
Pleasure. Cheers,
Thank you, Andrew.
Thank you.
Cheers.